Today, we become legends.
Smite has over 120 gods, each with 4 unique abilities, 5 if you count passives, and add on a few extra for stance switches or other extra ability mechanics. Among these, many stand out as obviously strong, but what about some that aren't particularly viewed as strong but fly under the radar a little bit? Well, that's what we'll discuss in today's video. Here's some of Smite's most underrated abilities. To start, I'll quickly say that I'm not saying these abilities can't be viewed as strong already, I'm just saying that in my personal opinion, they aren't regarded as highly as they should be. That could mean they're good, but regarded as average. It could mean they're amazing, but regarded as just pretty good. And of course, this is all my own personal take, and I'm sure some of you out there will know how strong some of these abilities are, even if the majority of players don't. Let's jump in. So before we get into the list of actual underrated abilities, I have a few honorable mentions for some that are ridiculously good, but that people have become wise to over the years. Firstly, Achilles II. Many years ago, this would have made the actual list, but I think people have woken up to how strong this ability is somewhat recently, especially with the changes it got last year. 40 of each protections, which can increase up to 61 if you have shackled enemies, 30% CCR, bonus basic attack damage, 45 HP 5, and all of that for a whopping 6 seconds. Super strong ability, but I do feel people know that now. Barber ult is a similar story, perhaps in part due to her laughably weak release, but even after it was buffed to high heaven, it took people a while to realize how utterly busted this ultimate is. It's absolutely among the best in the game with completely absurd potential damage output and massive safety, but people do know that now. Poseidon's 2 fits into these mentions as well in my opinion, as I think the recent mage solo meta really woke people up to how busted this ability actually is. 25% increased basic attack damage plus an extra 120 flat from the bonus projectiles, basically instant max tide meter for free, bonus attack speed, ridiculous movement speed especially when combined with tide, and an effective 9-second cooldown given it starts when you use the ability, not when it expires, and it lasts 6 seconds. Meaning the 15-second cooldown essentially becomes 9. This mechanic also makes CDR ridiculously good for it, given it works off of the base 15-second cooldown, not the effective 9-second cooldown, meaning with max CDR, this ability is only down for 3 seconds before it's back up again. Super insane, but I do think people now realize how good it actually is, hence it doesn't make the real list. Hebo 2 is another one that people are definitely aware of nowadays. The complete slow immunity for potentially the whole team and slept-on safety that this provides Hebo is super good. And finally for the honorable mentions, Khepri 2. 30% mitigation on allies and 25% protection shred on enemies is just insane. It might not look like this ball is doing much, but behind the scenes it's wreaking havoc on people's stats. Okay, so first up for the actual list is Achilles II. This is one of those abilities that definitely is viewed as good by most competent players. However, I would argue this ability is completely broken, not just good. Of course, it provides a pretty strong heal for sustaining in lane or team fights, but it also provides a 10% power boost and 20% protections boost, along with 20% CCR, which as a stat in itself is underrated, as you don't really notice a CC affecting you for 0.2 seconds less than normal, but it makes a big difference over the course of the game, not just by sometimes saving you from a quick CC chain back to the fountain, but also just enabling you to be more in control slightly more often, which allows you to get more damage out and avoid more damage effectively. The final thing to mention about Achilles II is the ridiculous 9-second cooldown, which goes down to 5.4 seconds with max CDR, which you will have on Achilles even around the mid-game when teamfights start to happen. The buff itself lasts 6 seconds, so literally more than half the entire match, Achilles is buffed up with all these free stats and healing. This ability is insane, and while it is widely regarded as strong, it's way stronger than a lot of people give it credit for. Next up is Atlas Ultimate, which I was pretty torn on whether to put on the actual list or the honorable mentions, as I have been preaching how broken this ability is under the hood basically since this guy's release. Shredding up to 50% of enemies' protections is just completely insane, and combined with his 2 gives Atlas the potential to completely nullify a tank's frontline presence by basically turning them into a slightly bulkier backliner for the full duration of the ult plus 5 seconds afterwards. It also does way more damage than you'd think and reduces power by up to 30%, so no matter who you're hitting, backliners or frontliners, this ability is getting some insane value that is kind of hard to notice, because it's mostly just stat changes rather than big flashy damage or CC. Speaking of stat changes versus flashiness though, a Wheelexal is up next, which sure can be an absolute death sentence if she pulls you in with it without beads. But where the underrated part of Gravity Surge comes in is the absolutely ridiculous 60 power and 70% attack speed and immunity to 3 extremely common CCs all for 6 seconds after ulting. You're basically fighting with 8 items instead of 6 for the duration, as well as immune to slows, knockups and roots, which encompasses about half of all the total CCs in Smite. This is great for shredding objectives and enemy gods alike, as the attack speed combined with her base attack speed puts her on similar levels to other auto attack assassins at full build, except she has a full power build. And 60 extra free power, meaning her autos chunk way harder after ulting than even a Bakasura might do. Oh, and it does all this on a base 60-second cooldown, which I guess is because the active part of the ult gets countered so completely by beads, but when you factor in the other aspects, it really has no business being on a 36-second cooldown with max CDR. Definitely underrated for sure. Next up is Balon's 1, which gets nowhere near the credit it deserves in my opinion. Up to 3 instant block stacks and another one basically every second or so, or even less depending on your attack speed, is the reason Balon completely shuts down hunters and other auto attackers in the late game. Plus, the block stacks reflect 30% of the initial damage before mitigations back at the attacker, which especially in a crit meta can add hundreds of damage in a matter of seconds to Balon's already high DPS with Acts of Animosity and Kin Size. It's not a flashy ability, but it's one of the best single ways in the game to deal with late game hunters, and it doesn't get enough credit. Cerberus 2 is my next underrated ability, which is quite frankly busted and very few people seem to realize it. Starting with the damage, this is incredible for a Guardian at 420 base and 87.5% scaling. That's competing with a lot of solid mage abilities and far outclasses almost anything else offered by Guardians. The slow stacks up in less than a second and maxes out at 36%, which is pretty disgusting, but the main part of this ability that makes it so broken is the up to 51 magical protection shred. As far as I'm aware, that's the most flat shred of any ability in the game, at the very least of any basic ability, and it pretty much means the latter portion of this ability, any other abilities you use afterwards, and any follow-up from your mage are all dealing close to true damage to backliners. For reference, basically every squishy in the game has 62 magical protections at level 20. Combine this with a Damaru, and because percent pen applies first, you are literally doing true damage to backliners with this ability and any follow-up. Sure, some support auras probably mean they still have a few measly protections, but the damage increase from shredding off 51 magical procs is absurd. And that's all at level 20. For the brief period where you have this ability maxed but enemies aren't level 20 yet, you are literally doing true damage. This ability is insane and I almost never hear anyone talk about how busted it is. Definitely deserving of the list. Next up is Achilles II, Torrent. The damage on this is respectable at 340 plus 70%, but with good play you'll often be able to connect the dash to your axe, which adds an extra 170 to the base, making this an over 500 base damage ability when used to its maximum potential. But much like Cerberus, the truly underrated aspect of this ability is the protections it gives. Up to 100 of each for 6 seconds to be specific. Despite the fact that protections have diminishing efficiency, 100 of both for 6 seconds is completely ridiculous. Granted, you need to hit 2 gods at once in a teamfight to get max value, and it's much easier to just use this on the wave in solo during the laning phase. But even hitting just 1 god with this grants 50 of each protections, which is basically an item's worth, and is still amazing to boost your tankiness. Oh, and Torrent does all this on a base 9-second cooldown in the late game. That's 5.4 seconds with max CDR, which you almost certainly have on Chak. And yes, the buff lasts 6 seconds, meaning you can, in theory, have these protections up permanently in the mid to late game. This ability is crazy strong and does not get enough credit. On the topic of tankiness, CThulu's 1 is my next underrated ability, which takes a page out of Torrent's book by essentially giving you permanent tankiness. This takes the form of 30% damage reduction from targets hit by your 1. This lasts 6 seconds just like Torrent, and with the base cooldown of 10 seconds, that becomes 6 seconds at max CDR, meaning you can, at least in theory, permanently take 30% less damage from your target. The attack speed, slow, and fear are of course nice on this as well, but the main reason it's here is that mitigation. So my next one is another that arguably could just be an honorable mention, as people have woken up to how strong this ability is lately. That being ESET's 3 Dispel Magic. This is pretty much the sole reason ESET support completely dominated a couple of years ago. Sure, her ult is nice and having a stun is always good, but Dispel Magic is completely insane as a supportive ability when you consider all it does. Great range, which can effectively go out 70 units at maximum due to the 55 range and 15 radius. A strong slow, percent magical prot shred, 2.5 second silence, and a shield that can be as strong as 400 depending on how many targets you hit. Even the 250 base shield is strong given it hits all allies near ESET and near the Dispel Magic circle itself. It's very easy to hit multiple allies with this shield and it absolutely does work. This ability just does so much stuff, and despite the fact that many people do now know how busted it is, I thought it should still make the list. Next up is a spicy one, that being Hades' ult. A lot of people place this ult as one of the absolute worst in the game, though of course none can top Charybdis in that. However, I think this ability does go severely underrated. Don't get me wrong, it's by no means the strongest ult in the game given how easily it's countered by movement abilities, beads, and Aegis. But when it actually does catch someone, this ability can be completely devastating. The damage of 840 plus 240% scaling easily does more than half of a backliner's health on its own. It also shreds 30 flat and 10% of the enemy's protections, making it hit even harder. And of course, boosting any follow-up from your team as well. A lot of people probably don't know this, but it also reduces Hades' active cooldowns by 0.4 seconds per tick, and with 8 ticks total, that's a potential 3.2 seconds off of his base kit, so he can follow up with another round of it afterwards. The craziest part of this ability though is the absolutely absurd 160 of both protections that Hades gets for the duration. Even a full damage Hades basically turns into a frontline tank while using this, and it makes him extremely hard to kill. So if you do get caught in this, bursting him down isn't really an option unless you can commit multiple people to shredding him. Again, this isn't among the best ults in the game, but a lot of people consider it one of the absolute worst, when in my opinion, it's a solid ability that can do work if you burn enemies' relics and movement abilities before dropping it. My next choice is somewhat similar, at least in reason. Ixchel's ult is often cited as one of the worst ults that Smite has to offer, but in my opinion, this ability is above average at worst and pretty damn strong at best. The absolute maximum damage this ability can do is 2600 base and 400% scaling. Of course, that's extremely unrealistic and requires healing an ally and damaging an enemy for the entire duration and never missing a tick to keep up the subsequent hit damage boost. But even when you're not using the ally heal to boost the duration, it still hits really hard, like 1365 plus 210% scaling hard. Plus, it's a beam you have complete control over and is damn near unmissable, so racking up that subsequent hit damage bonus is pretty easy. Long duration CC immunity and omni movement are always valuable as well, and the 15% damage mitigation and between 30 and 60% missing health heal helps keep her alive so she can get that damage out. Just like Hades, there are definitely a lot of better ults out there than this, but it's far from one of the worst in the game and does go underrated in my opinion. Keeping with the mages, this next one is another that you could argue isn't that underrated, as a lot of people do recognize its power, that being Nox's ultimate, Night Terror. When most people think of Nox, they think of that devastating 2-1 combo, and while that is her bread and butter and most of the reason you would want to play her, do not sleep on Nox's ultimate or you will regret it. The damage is pretty average, the range is excellent, but of course the reason I say this ability is underrated is the 30% damage reduction for 5 seconds that it applies to enemies. Engaging a fight with this basically gives the enemies two choices: disengage at all costs and potentially get collapsed on, or take the fight with your carries only doing 70% of the damage that Nox's carries are doing for 5 seconds. It's also great as a counter engager. If the enemy dives onto your backline, hitting them with this gives your squishies a lot more room to play with thanks to the damage reduction. This did get nerfed from 40% somewhat recently, which is why I'm a little bit hesitant to include it on the list, but I think overall this ability still flies under the radar, just like it flies into the enemy backline. And finally, my last underrated ability for this video is Xbalanque's Darkest of Nights. This ability used to be considered one of the best ults in the game back in the day, due to a combination of low power level and of course the fact that this would stun enemies that were moving when the blind ended. That said, I do feel like after that nerf, everyone just assumed this ability was useless and one of the worst in the game, when it's still pretty damn good. A 3-second global blind on its own is always useful, but this also almost doubles your basic attack range and gives 60% attack speed and movement speed for the duration. This ability is still really good, despite a lot of people assuming the stun nerf made it worthless. But that's all I've got for this video. What are your personal underrated ability picks? Do you agree with my picks here, or did a few of the ones I chose not sit right with you? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.